Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here this wonderful Seattle day. But we are going to have a wonderful lecture by our guest, Professor Nabil Matar. Forgive my pronunciation. My name is Selim Kuru. I am an associate professor of Ottoman and Turkish studies, as well as the chair in Near Eastern Languages and Civilization department. And I am very happy to see you at the department's Ferhat Jacob Ziadeh Distinguished Lecture in Arab and Islamic Studies 2018 session. Let me offer my thanks first to our administrator, Patrick Gibbs, and our program assistant, he is not here today, Rick Aguilar, for their logistical help with this event. I would like to mention also Kara Hafley from the Advancement Office who made this night work so well. Thanks also due to those who have supported the endowment, Ferhat Ziadeh endowment that makes this annual event possible. We could not have made it 15 years, in fact more than 15, we needed to skip 1 year without a lecture. Without your help and with your continuing help, we will be able to organize such exciting and informative events that will make us knowledgeable and consequently more responsible individuals, inshallah. And you can see the past lecture titles and the scholars who have been here on the slideshow that Patrick prepared for us. Thank you again.
Yeah, next time I'll get the fonts better, I'm sorry.
Okay. Since the creation of the Ziadeh Fund in 2001, with your support, it has allowed us to strengthen our educational reach, showcase the most outstanding scholarship in Arab and Islamic studies. These presentations used to be published. Now we will go for a digital publication format, uploading videos of the talks on our YouTube channel for the series. And of course, all this we do to honor our late Professor Ferhat Ziadeh, who we lost on June 8, 2016. He will always be remembered not only for his contributions to the fields of Islamic law, Arabic language, and Islamic studies, but also as an individual who added so much grace and kindness to lives of so many people, as a teacher and as a friend. I'm very happy to see lovely Suad, his wife, here with us tonight. Thank you for making it here. And also their daughters, Rhonda and Rima, are with us, and grandchildren, Jacob and Julia. So we are with the family, we are stronger. Thank you. On April 8, 2018, Ferhat would have been 101 years old. And the department prepared a video to commemorate his legacy. I am extremely thankful to Professors Terry DeYoung and Naomi Sokolov for taking part in its production. And I am also thankful to John Overland and his team for the production at the UW video. Our administrator, Patrick Gibbs, again, and our MA student, Sean Nami's help during this process should also be mentioned. This video is a first step of an ongoing project about the history of our department, Near Eastern Languages and Civilization, which will celebrate its 50th anniversary in 2 years. You will hear more about this. Now, tonight it will work this way. We will first watch a short video, and after that I will come back and introduce you our Islamic Studies Professor Hamza Zafer to introduce our valuable guest.
Ferhat Ziadeh arrived in Seattle in 1966, already an accomplished scholar of Islamic law and lawyer. His arrival marked the dawn of a new era at the University of Washington.
At the time of his arrival, there were only a few classes about Islamic philosophy. Not much about the history of Near East or culture of Near East. So he started from the scratch with Nicholas Hare in order to establish a department, in fact to establish a new department which started in 1970 at the University of Washington, Near Eastern Languages and Civilization.
He was a leading scholar in his field. He was a very well-known national figure as well as a beloved professor on this campus.
People usually speak of the Judeo-Christian culture. To my mind, they should be speaking of the Judeo-Christian Muslim culture.
He was instrumental in founding the department here, selflessly working for hours, not just for in the department, to make it a nationally ranked department, one that's highly respected. But he also worked on the Middle East Center.
A graduate of Princeton, Ziadeh was one of 50 founding members of the Middle East Studies Association. In 1980, he served as president, and in 1997 was awarded the prestigious Mesa Mentoring Award.
It's the sine qua non of the place to go to present, and he was deeply involved in helping the board of the Middle East Center continue after his retirement. But you can't minimize how much work he did at the beginning to found it.
A mentor to students and colleagues alike, Ziadeh shared his personal thirst for learning with all.
He used to call himself as the last Ottoman because he was born in 1917 during the end of the last year of the empire, Ottoman Empire. He was an elegant man with his language, with his actions. He became a model for our students and for his colleagues as well, for me at least, how a scholar should be, how a teacher should be.
He was a caring teacher. He was an incredibly helpful. He would spend hours with his students. I think that in the class I took with him, there were only like 4 of us. But he spent literally hours and would make time for us if we wanted to talk to him.
One of the things I remember most keenly about him was that he asked to sit in on one of my courses. So this was in the early 1990s. It was a course designed for students who had enough Hebrew skills to read the text in the original and then also to carry on discussions in Hebrew. So he wanted to improve his Hebrew skills, and he was a very good student, which I don't think would surprise anybody, but he was very modest about his knowledge.
Scholar, teacher, mentor, author. For decades, his Arabic textbook remained in use by Middle East scholars everywhere.
Shaking their hips and doing all
Farhat Ziadeh's legacy at the University of Washington and the world lives on.
His legacy is establishing Arabic language teaching in the United States as a professional field. Second, his research on Islamic law and laying the foundations of the study of Islamic law in the United States and the world. But these are his scholarly legacy.
Thank you very much, Professor Ziadeh.
His legacy as a teacher is establishing Near Eastern Languages and Civilization as a department at the University of Washington and adding to the diversity of the university with his personality as well as his impeccable knowledge. I think I would fall short of words to thank him, but I would hold his hand, look into his eyes, which he would be welcoming, and smile and say, "Thank you, Farhat. Thank you for all those that you have given us, our students." We are missing him, and we will be missing him. But his legacy, I think, in short, is as a model human being. I will remember him always with his warmth. But tonight, we will hear a wonderful talk by Professor Nabil Matar, and I would like to invite our faculty at Near Eastern Languages and Civilization Department, Dr. Hamza Zafer, who is a scholar of early Islam and classical Arabic with a knowledge and interest in major languages of late antiquity. His class on Ge'ez, recently old Ethiopic, for example, was a big hit in Seattle. We weren't expecting this. Hamza recently submitted his book manuscript titled A Prehistory of the Caliphate, the Quran, the Quraysh, and the Paradox of Early Muslim History. And he's already working on his second project with the tentative title, The Matriarchs of Medina, Muhammad's Wives and Wet Nurses in Early Muslim Histories of Empire, about which he is also teaching a class, offering a class this quarter. Hamza has been a very active young scholar who attends international and national conferences and projects. He is also a part of the International Quran Seminar Project. Let me also take this moment to mention that after tonight's walk, we will have a Q&A session, and then you're all welcome to walk across the corridor to the Walker Ames room for a reception. Hamza, can I invite you to the podium? Thank you.
Thank you, Salim. Good evening, everybody. On behalf of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, I'd like to welcome you all to the 2018 Distinguished Lecture, Farhad Ziadeh Distinguished Lecture. This is the first time we're having this lecture after the passing of our dear Ustad, our dear teacher, Farhad Ziadeh. And having this lecture is a way for us to continue his work, to honor his memory, to honor his legacy. So I'm very happy that we're continuing this task, finally getting back to it. I'm sure Farhad would be very happy. It is my distinct honor to welcome to our campus today Dr. Nabil Matar, who is the Presidential Professor of English at the University of Minnesota. Professor Matar has had an illustrious academic career. He focuses as a scholar on encounters between the Arab world and the Western world in early modernity. He is a prolific author. He has written several books, most recently An Arab Ambassador in the Mediterranean World and British Captives in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. Today he is delivering a lecture to us on his most recent project, which is titled The United States Through Arab Eyes. So I'd like to join all of you in welcoming Professor Matar to the stage.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored and privileged to be here to give the memorial lecture. I'm very delighted to see the family of Professor Ziadeh and to have had dinner with them, to have enjoyed it. So thank you so much. Also to thank the Hamza for his generous introduction, to thank also Salim for gracious lunch, and really to thank everybody here, Patrick as well, who's been very active with me. This has been a wonderful visit, but really I want to thank you all for bringing such a lovely weather. Because I don't know if you know that, but 11 days ago we had 22 inches of snow in Minneapolis. So being here is a great occasion. I'm going to start with a few words about this project that I'm working on, and it's kind of the Arab views of America before World War I. And it's kind of, this is a title I'm going to be using in most of my forthcoming works, which is Through Arab Eyes. It started in 2011. I wrote a book, again, kind of long introduction and translations of Europe through Arab Eyes. And since then, I've been collecting material for two projects, other than this one, on Mediterranean piracy through Arab Eyes, and then European missions through Arab Eyes. Now, all these are in the early modern period. And as you can see, the emphasis is on Arab Eyes. My sense is that much scholarship needs to be done, further done, on the early modern period in terms of the Arabic sources. These have been completely ignored, very rarely kind of cited, very rarely dug up, but there's a lot. And the point that I would like to make is that there is a perspective in historiography that is Arabic. It is mixed in terms of, again, the meaning of Arabic. It can be kind of multi-religious. Obviously, historically in civilization, that's how it was. But the point is that there has not been as much work that should be done on the Arabic archive as there should be. And so, you know, it was kind of inevitable that I'd want to do something about the United States. Initially, I wanted to do something about, again, the United States and early modern Arabic writings. And basically, these would have been Moroccan, who were the first to know about the United States and actually to mention the word itself, America, in Arabic. But that kind of was limited in terms of the scope of interpretation. And then, you know, all of a sudden, I kind of found that there is by far more kind of wider range of material in the second part of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. Now, the subject of Arab American literature, as Terry here and others will confirm, it's been growing in the past, and the study of that has been growing in the past, decades. And my point in working on this project is really I don't want to kind of look at it from the top. What did the first immigrants who came here, what did they see? What did they understand of this world? They came nearly always, not all of them, but most of them, vast majority, without a single word of English. What did they know? What did they see? What did they write in Arabic? What did they publish in Arabic? And what did they, in their dreams, in their personal memoirs, in their kind of letters home, what did they describe about this world? And so that's basically what I want to do. And I found that the material there is a kind of a mixed bag of material, published in the United States as well as in the home countries, chiefly Lebanon and Egypt, and reaching readership all across the world where Arabic-speaking peoples had emigrated. The writers reflected on America that was admitting large numbers of immigrants and immigrants, rebuilding itself after the Civil War and Reconstruction, and moving ahead with industrialization, the accumulation of capital, and the ongoing crisis of racism. It was really a mixed bag of material, basically newspaper reports, memoirs, kind of quasi-adventures, quasi-autobiographies, a history. So it's a mixed bag and kind of trying to find something that gives a perspective on all this. It was really an amazing kind of range of material. And that's what I was trying to do, is to look at this material from the bottom up, warts and all, because there are lots of warts there. Now, I'm an old-fashioned sort of guy. I still have a flip phone. And I want to tell you what my sons say when they see me carrying that. But there is a fly sheet, so it might help just in terms of the many names that I might mention. I'm going to start with the quotation and the translation. We must leave this ship right now. We don't want them to send us back to our country. No one will be sent back from here. If they force me to another ship, I will jump and swim to New York. These are words taken from a novel by a Lebanese writer, Rabia Jabir, and the name of the novel is America. It was published in 2012, and it describes the experience of one family coming to the United States. All the immigrants were desperate to enter the United States and not to be sent back to the poverty of their Ottoman-ruled homeland. After passing through Ellis Island, at least after 1892, the early immigrants and visitors traveled widely around the country, whether as laborers or peddlers, ba'at al-jizdan, that's how they were known, as correspondents for journals in the Middle East, or as entrepreneurs. No region was too remote or too forbidding. As Mikhail Rustum, the author of the first published book in Arabic in the United States, joked, I quote, "Two men succeeded in discovering the North Pole. If there's to be a third, he will be a Syrian peddler." End of quote. The use of Syrian, by the way, I'm going to be using that frequently. Syrian, Lebanese, Arab, all these were kind of still vague terminologies in terms of identity definitions. After their wanderings, some sought homelands in states as sparsely inhabited as the Dakotas, while others settled in the main cities of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, where they encountered for the first time in their lives new and different religious and ethnic communities. The views they developed about those communities reflected their different levels of exposure, from men and women who had to learn a few words of English in order to eke out a living on the streets, to an educated man like Khalil Sakakini, who assisted Columbia University professor Richard Gothill in his research and editorial work, and from Egyptian government officials sent on state missions to women who had to confront Arab male chauvinism and cultural restrictions. Many wrote in Arabic periodicals and newspapers about the America I saw, the America that I saw, America التي رأيتها. And they shared their essays and reviews with readers in Egypt, Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon, as well as in the United States. The early immigrants were transnational in their thinking and identity, holding on to the memories and history of their homelands while and describing their experiences in the new land. And with the America they saw, most immigrants were pleased, so much so that in 1898, Lebanese Syrian Jibra'il Werd, later he translates his name to Rose, patriotically volunteered to fight in the war against Spain and Cuba, eager to defeat, as he called, the tyranny that he had read about in the newspapers. Later, many others joined in World War I, whose pictures he included in his 1919 book, written in Arabic and published in New York, including the compliments, and I quote because some parts were in English, and this is in English, the compliments of the Ramallah Young Men's Society, 145 of whose members were with the colors. And I mentioned that just because Farhat came from Ramallah. But at the same time, other writers registered criticism of America, of American harsh industrialization and its brutal labor conditions. Criticisms that echo the scathing descriptions in the 1906 American classic, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. Arabic writings from the period between 1876 and 1914 reflect views about the United States before the country began its rise to the status of an imperial world power. The date of 1876 marks the visit by an Egyptian official, Edouard Elias, who wrote the first Arabic account about the United States. And 1914 is the year after the publication in Cairo of the first extensive Arabic travelogue about North America. Just after the sinking of the Titanic in summer of 1912, in which, by the way, a number of Arab immigrants drowned, Prince Muhammad Ali, the grandson of the great Muhammad Ali, Prince Muhammad Ali traveled from Egypt to the United States and Canada, during which time he kept a memoir. The two authors, Edouard Elias and Prince Muhammad Ali, were Egyptian dignitaries, and therefore saw the United States from above. They were not poor, were not intent on immigration, and were not culturally insecure. They could observe, comment, and be amused at American peculiarities. But the larger number of Arab arrivals were the small immigrants who rose from below, forced by circumstance to become what anthropologists might call, participant observers. These men and women described the full range of their experience of America. An arrival and search for work, fear or success, homesickness or integration, suicide, or, in one case, near cannibalism. These immigrants were in the trenches and wrote about their encounter with basically four categories that I have on the sheet: racial and ethnic minorities in America, such as basically the various groups: Native Americans, Jews, Quakers, Chinese, Irish, and Mormons. Secondly, B, their uncertainty about the role of women in a society that permitted women the indecency of swimming with men, while at the same time offering them opportunities to become financially independent. Also in America, the immigrants discovered the need to negotiate, and this is number C, their Syrian Arab identity in the face of a powerful culture that threatened them with Americanization, ta'amruk. Many of the immigrants assimilated into American life and identity. But there were many others who, this is number D, came, saw, and returned. It is striking that some of the greatest literary figures of the Arab Renaissance, the Nahda, actually belonged to that category, who came to the United States, stayed here, and then returned to the Middle East. I'm going to start with the minorities, number A. Arriving in the United States, the Arabs came face to face with peoples they had seen and people they had not seen in their home countries. Inevitably, and as they started learning English and adapting to their surroundings, they picked up the prevalent discourse of American racism. It may well be that those who were literate among them had also read some of the racist articles and reports that had been translated from English and French and published in Arabic periodicals in the Middle East. Historically, racial differentiation did not mark Arabic thinking in the period under study. More divisive were the religious and the social stratifications. Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Nusayri, Druze, Metauli, etc., or urban versus peasant, prince versus commoner. But in the United States, the dominant discourse or divide was racial. And so immigrants eager to be integrated accepted it. Even the two Egyptian visitors fell victims to some expressions of bigotry, a bigotry that reflected moments of the heightened xenophobia in America. I will focus on only two groups, one totally unfamiliar to the immigrants and one quite familiar. The first is the one with which they were completely unfamiliar, and that is the Native Americans. One of the unfortunate targets of bigotry in the United States of the late 19th, early 20th century were the Native Americans. In his account, Edouard Elias adopted the American discourse of triumphalism over Indians, although he did not mention in his travelogues any meeting with them. He vilified them after listening to his American hosts, from whom he picked up words such as lynching, and actually writes that in English. Less than half a century earlier, the English traveler Frances Trollope had noted exactly the same influence. It was from her conversations with Americans, she wrote, that she heard the statements which represent the Indians as treacherous and false, almost beyond belief, in their intercourse with the unhappy Indians, end of quote. Like her, Arabs had had no idea about Indians, and so they picked up the derogatory views and repeated them both in the United States and overseas. An article in the Beirut-based periodical Al-Jinan by Boutros al-Bustani, it was founded in 1870. The article was in 1883 and translated from the New York Tribune, mentioned how the Indians, quote, waged war on us, killing and pillaging the whites, end of quote. A year later, another article in the same periodical spoke, quote, of savages who still lived like Bedouins in the Stone Age, end of quote. In 1895, Kaukab America, the first Arabic newspaper in the United States, which had started in 1892, reported how Indians slaughtered their chiefs when they became senile. A correspondent, Muqtatab, in the United States, Yusuf Jirji Zakham, wrote for Al-Muqtabas in Cairo how the Indians lived, quote, like wild animals, end of quote. And although he mentioned that out of the 276 million acres the Indians had possessed of fertile lands, they were left with only 7 million, he still added that they were, quote, hard-necked, spending their time in life wandering from place to place, end of quote. He was not surprised, therefore, that those Indians, savage peoples, as he called them, were going extinct. And in looking at paintings and photographs and circus shows, he thought them similar in features, quote, to Chaldeans and Bedouins, end of quote. The cacophony of bigotry extended from the Middle East to the United States. But there were dissenting voices, significantly by writers in the United States who may have learned by far more about the plight of the Indians than their counterparts back home. When an American newspaper described how Indian children were told to celebrate Columbus Day because, and I quote, had not Columbus reached here, they would not have had the good education they were having, end of quote, the Kaukab editor, Ibrahim Arjili, their brothers, Ibrahim and Najib Arbili, commented sarcastically that the newspaper forgot how Columbus had slaughtered the ancestors of those children, stolen their lands, and enslaved them. As knowledge grew of the history of the destruction of the North American Indians, Arab voices rose in supportive sympathy. Before returning to Egypt from the United States in 1908, the secularist reformer Farah Antoun stood one day before Niagara Falls and called, quote, "Do you remember, O waterfall, the day when your riverbank was the home of those pitiful Indians before others reached you and usurped their land unjustly and brutally," end of quote. But the most sympathetic description of the Indians, and the first in Arabic print, was written by a gold prospector who actually visited Indians in Alaska. Jibra'il Assaf Mir'i, he praised their dedication and hard work, the beautiful schools and churches they had built, their endurance at times of hardship, and most importantly, the kindness they expressed to the poor, even among the white race. Another description of the Indians appears in the travelogue of Prince Muhammad Ali. Although he too used terms like savages, mutawahishin, about the Indians, he offered detailed descriptions of their lives, habitations, conditions, and crafts. He discussed their origins, wondered about similarities between them and the blacks of Africa, and reflected on the cruelty of white discrimination against them. It's significant that by the end of his journey, and after seeing so much suffering among the Indians, he lambasted humanity, and not just the whites, all humanity, l'insaniya, for failing to come to their help. Like Alexis de Tocqueville, and he had read Alexis de Tocqueville quite carefully, he was appalled at the poverty and destitution that he saw. But while Mir'i had stayed with Indians, eating and conversing, at least in sign language, with them, Prince Muhammad observed them from a distance. And it is to the credit of these two writers, coming as they did from different social and religious backgrounds, that they took pains to write compassionately. Jews. In the second half of the 19th century, anti-Semitism was on the increase in Europe, and so the Arabic press in Cairo and Beirut and Jerusalem rose in defense of the Jews. The defense stemmed from the Arab sense of community. Writers viewed Jews as part of their home societies, and there were Jewish populations in the main cities of the Levant, from Beirut to Damascus to Jerusalem to Cairo. Judaism, after all, was a millet denomination protected by Ottoman and Islamic law. It had been so since the Ottoman conquest of the East in the early 16th century. The first issue of Al-Jinan attacked a book that had recently been published and that had maligned the Jews. And 2 years later, in 1872, it published another article in defense of the Jews. In 1881, Al-Muqtataf translated the reply of British Rabbi Adler against anti-Semitic writings, crediting hostility to Jews to, quote, Germanic fanatics, end of quote. Anti-Semitism increased in the wake of the Dreyfus affair in France in 1894, but in 1898, the conservatively Islamic Al-Manar, this was kind of very Islamic periodical, condemned the bigotry against Jews in that country, blaming it not just on religious fanaticism, but also on the envy of French newspaper editors who were greedy for the wealth of the Jews. We hope, concluded the author, which was Rashid Rida, we hope that the European disease will not reach our shores, end of quote. Importantly, the defense of the Jews was carried out by both Christian and Muslim writers. In 1870, the Lebanese Christian thinker, Boutros al-Bustani, called in his Al-Jinan for brotherhood among Turks, Arabs, Druze, Jews, Maronites, Orthodox, and others. While the Lebanese Muslim reformer, Rashid Rida, in his Al-Manar, praised the Ottoman Dawlat for welcoming Jews fleeing from persecution. This religious inclusiveness crossed the Atlantic with the emigrants. During the 1884 journey of the 4 Lebanese to the United States, as recorded by priest Basil Kherbawi, Arabic-speaking Jews played the most helpful role. As one Anthony Tadros, who became quite wealthy later, told his story, it was an Arabic-speaking Jew who gave him and his companions the best advice when they reached Marseille, actually warned them against the many Christian and Muslim compatriots who waylaid immigrants in Marseille and stole their money. In 1892, Kaukab America, the newspaper, decried the treatment of Jews in Russia and their expulsion from their homes. And a few months later, on 13 May, it denounced, and this is in the one page that it had in English, it denounced the Polish anti-Semitic riot. And that's, as I say, the English side. In that same year, a Jewish merchant by the name of Azra Sit was described as one of the sons of the homeland, Awlad Biladina, who joined the Syrian Brethren at the New York exhibit to sell his wares. And in his garrulous book about the Arab immigrants in the United States, Mikhail Rustum praised a renowned woman, Estir, for her excellent oratory and took pride in her because she was a Jewish woman from our homeland, Biladina. In 1900, there was a New York report about the jihad of the Maronites against their corrupt clergy, in which they joined together with the Catholics, the Orthodox, the Jews, and all other concerned Syrians. In his travelogue, Prince Muhammad periodically mentioned how much he enjoyed meeting with Jews from the Ottoman Empire in the United States. And in 1919, Jibreel Werd, the guy I mentioned earlier, gave brief biographies of Syrians who respected, he gave brief biographies of Syrians who were respected writers and businessmen in the Arabic-speaking community of immigrants. One of the entries was the following, and that's on the sheet. From Yusuf Hakim, 71 Wall Street, New York. Yusuf Hakim is a noble and generous man from one of the old Jewish families in Damascus. Like others, he came to this land and with energy, dedication, other qualities for which he was known, was able to walk the road to success. He started working with dedication and achieved what he wanted. His successful business in olive oil is the greatest proof of his hard work, and he is ever willing to express his nationalist feelings and his deep love to everything that is Syrian. End of quote. This association might help to explain why the Arab immigrants were often associated by American writers with Jews. Women, item B. One of the major challenges that faced immigrants was the changing role of women. Najib Abdo, author of the first almanac about Arabs in America and the world, included an advertisement about a kimono store owner by the name of Miss Ziadeh Al-Hajj, which she had placed in his almanac. She stated that in the United States, women were equal to men in word and deed. And so, and I quote, Syrian and American patrons should visit her store, which she had established 11 years earlier in 1896 on 44 Broadway, Suite 414, New York City. She gives the address. Women were pursuing their own economic initiatives in America. And from Egypt, Warda Yazigi contrasted the Eastern woman with her European and American counterparts and praised the latter for writing newspaper articles and studying astronomy and chemistry. There was such interest among the readership of periodicals and newspapers to promote the role of women that the Philadelphia and later New York-based Al-Huda, a newspaper, designated space. It had a corner, women's corner, for writers about that subject. A year later, in 1899, Afifa Zain wrote about the need for decency in Syrian women's attire, a topic that was also being discussed in the Arabic press in Egypt and Lebanon. And a decade later, Afifa Karam, a frequent contributor to the newspaper, wrote, and I quote, "The Syrian woman is being discussed by two groups of men. One group seeks to educate, enlighten, and edify her, and the other seeks to keep her in ignorance. They represent two camps, the camp of reform and the camp of defeat. To which camp, O reader, do you belong?" End of quote. In some respect, this tension reflected the social class of the observers. Writers such as Ilyas and Prince Muhammad Ali, coming from wealth and status, wanted women to be conservative and modest, at a time when a large number of women immigrants in the United States had been sent by their husbands from the homelands to peddle and face danger and humiliation. These women arrived in the United States without husbands or supporters. And actually, the novel America tells about one such woman. Some came in pursuit of work and income, others of husbands, and others still to escape abusive and kind of indolent husbands, as was the case with the mother of Khalil Gibran. These women showed courage in undertaking dangerous crossings at sea, and on arrival, they joined what one historian called the army of peddlers, after which some fell victim to violence and dishonor. From the start, there was concern about women leaving their homelands. But then the women could make money by adding an extra peddler to the household. Still, there was anger at the men. A correspondent from St. Paul, Minnesota, complained about men sending their women to work on the roads while they stayed at home and got drunk. There were so many of these indolent husbands that, quote, "the Syrians have become the joke of the town," he wrote. As women were being forced to work and exposed to abuse, there was need to protect the Syrian, quote, "noble reputation," urged the writer. The influx of such women continued, so much so that they became the subject of constant newspaper exchanges. Some criticized the women, quote, "A woman whose blood and mind are corrupted by the desire for money will forget her honor, end of quote. But the editor of Al-Huda denounced the stay-at-home men in the East, quote, twiddling their mustaches, end of quote. Men sent their women to again, quote, to a land rife with immoralities and infidelities. Do not blame these miserable women. Blame their idle husbands, end of quote. Naively, an article published by sociologist Louise Seymour Houghton in 1911 about, and this in English, about Syrians in the United States, glamorized women peddlers. The peddler was, as she said, a free woman who enjoyed the autonomy of working, again, quote, at her own pleasure, rather than immuring herself within four noisy walls and be subject to the strict regime of the clock at the factory. Of course, Seymour had no idea about the dangers of peddling. Her view was belied by the many articles and reports in American, English, and Arabic newspapers that maligned these single Syrian women. English writers expressed surprise that while in the East women were protected at home, in the United States they were being pushed to go onto towns, even at night, knocking on doors to sell their wares. At the same time, an Arabic report described a pregnant Syrian woman, peddler, who gave birth on the street, leading to denunciations by the Americans. Other women deserted their husbands and children and fell into prostitution. Arabs from all around the United States sent letters to newspapers describing the dangers and the dire situations that peddling women and men faced, hoping to warn their compatriots about the shame and dishonor that they encountered. With their kushi, the kushi was this kind of basket that they carried in front of them on their, from their shoulder, hanging from their shoulders in front of them. With their kushi of marketable wares, women were easy prey. Thus, this and many other similar news items in Arabic. And this is the long kind of passage I have there. A Syrian woman by the name of Saghira, wife of Ilyas Yusuf Sleiman from Hadath al-Jubbi in Lebanon, was peddling in South Royalton, Vermont. A coach driver asked her if she needed a lift, showing her sympathy for the heavy weight she was carrying. She agreed, and he stretched out his hand and helped her into his coach and asked her where she wanted to go. She answered, the train station. He told her that he was going in that direction too and would take her there. But as he got close to the train station, he veered into a forest, pulled the woman down, and attempted to rape her by brute force. She defended herself heroically, and when he realized he could not satisfy his animalistic lust, he pulled out a knife to scare her. But she became stronger and defended herself. Her clothes were torn, and she was losing strength when some American women passed by who had heard her screaming. The barbarian fled, and the women helped the poor woman, the Syrian, and went with her to the police station. The culprit was captured, and the date was set for his trial, and he was condemned to 8 years in prison. When the trial was over, one of the judges stood up and praised in public the heroism and chastity of that woman, adding that the Syrians are the most protective of their honor. End of quote. And this account in the newspaper was written actually by the translator in the court. But not all women were as lucky. This is another report. The wife of Jirius Shaheen from the Lebanese village of Hardin, which is North Lebanon, and residing in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, about 20 years old, brownish in skin, stocky, blue eyes. 40 days ago, she left to peddle in order to make a living, and nothing has been heard of her since. As always, social class dictated alternative perspectives. Prince Muhammad Ali did not bother with the peddlers and never mentioned them. Addressing women in a higher social class, he urged them to remain faithful, quote, to our customs and traditions, and learn everything that would help a woman, quote, in fulfilling her duties to her husband and in properly raising her children, end of quote. At the same time, he admired the independence of American women. And although he was unhappy at seeing them on motorcycle, the transliteration from French for, and then that's what he gives in Arabic, bicycles that run on petrol, or dressed in jupe court, he realized that such women were mothers of the American youth who were forging the new nation. Quote, most of a child's character is acquired from the mother, and a nation will not advance unless the status of the mother is raised, end of quote. a view that had been expressed by the Egyptian social reformer Qasim Amin. When he reached Colorado Springs, the prince was delighted to meet a Syrian woman, recognized by her accent, a merchant, Tajira, who owned a store in the hotel where he was staying. Later in New York, he was impressed by Madame Sabbagh, the wife of Qaisar Sabbagh of the Syrian Unity Club, who represented to him the model of the Arab woman. After she gave a speech to welcome him, he described her as the spokeswoman for her Eastern sisters. He assured her that Eastern men have come to realize the importance of education for women. Quote, "We shall, with God's help, imitate the American ways in educating women and making them equal to their Western counterparts. But they will exceed them if they retain their Eastern moral values." End of quote. 3, identity. With the passage of time, the exposure to American culture began to precipitate a crisis of identity. So much so that in 1898, an article in Al-Huda coined the term mustamrik. And in 1909, Rustum, Mikhail Rustum, used the word muta'amrik, muhajir muta'amrik, Americanized immigrant. For him, the most humorous, by the way, he was the most humorous commentator on the Syrian community in the period. Ta'amruk was represented or expressed in daily behavior and misbehavior. In his diwan, he wrote a diwan in the first publication in 1895, and then he continued producing various further editions until the last one in 1921. So in his diwan, he gave advice about social etiquette and the qualities of the American, whom the Syrian was to emulate. Ta'amruk meant for him to learn not to eat garlic unless he could seclude himself for a week, to remove his hat at meeting a lady, to polish his shoes, not to burp in front of others, to give up his seat on the train to a lady, to wash and comb his hair twice a day, to not scratch his head in public, not leave a train while it's moving, and never to walk with a lady to his right. Rustum was clearly concerned about social integration and wanted the new arrivals to be able to mix smoothly in their various environments. Unfortunately, however, there were American traits that the fresh immigrants adopted, which were rather odious. Whistling, lighting a match by scrapping it on one's trousers, and pulling one's cap down the forehead. Also objectionable to Rustum was the Americanized Syrian man who started wearing tight shoes and chewing tobacco, or the woman who wore a corset, or those who started using English instead of Arabic and thinking in American terms, like the Egyptian man who gave his children the names of the cities in which they were born: Chicago, Philadelphia, Washington, McKinley, and New York. A common and much more problematic form of Americanization was conversion to Protestantism. In the context of Protestant-Catholic missionary rivalry in the United States and in the Middle East, such conversion was repeatedly denounced by Catholic writers in Lebanon, who subsequently took a firm stand against emigration. There are lots of writings against emigration, particularly in one of the journals at the time. Given that the largest number of early immigrants were Lebanese and Catholic, church authorities warned about the dangers and difficulties of emigration. In 1902, the most powerful and learned periodical, Al-Mashriq, which is an amazing journal at the time, published a report by Lebanese physicians after their annual meeting, which stated that 4/5 of all returnees from the pollution and hardship of America suffered from tuberculosis and venereal diseases. And I quote, "As for the corruption of religion and civility, there is no end to that." End of quote. As there was fear of apostasy among Catholics, to Americanization cum Protestantism, so there was among Muslims, who saw some Arabic-speaking immigrants recruited to convert them. Najib Abdu, the one who compiled the almanac, Najib Abdu reported that one Hanna Awad preached so convincingly that 100 Muslim families turned Christian. This conversionary factor may have been instrumental in discouraging Muslims from emigrating, since there were numerous known cases of Muslims who converted after their arrival in the United States. Khalil Sakakini, wrote in 1907 how a fellow Jerusalemite he met in New York by the name of Muhammad Isa At-Turi had converted to Christianity and took the name of Ibrahim Yusuf. And much as he missed his homeland, Yusuf told Sakakini that he would never go back because of his new religious affiliation. On 28 December of that year, Al-Huda, the newspaper, reported the conversion of Dawood As'ad al-Rishani, a Druze man, to Catholicism, to the Maronite faith, in St. Louis, Missouri. Such conversions may well explain why non-Christian immigrants did not try to return. But the two most daunting Americanization challenges that immigrants confronted were, first, America's work ethic, which put a premium on money making and ceaseless labor, and two, American political freedom. Both immigrants and travelers criticized the greed. This is a word that appears so frequently in the Arabic text in American life, a theme that had also informed, by the way, the writings of European travelers as far back as de Tocqueville. Amin Rihani did not like the, as he called, the Bible of endless work that was preached in the United States, and reminiscent about the mountains and valleys of Lebanon. Like Khalil Gibran, he always thought of returning to his village. And it's rather striking that Rihani, Mikhail Naimi, Farah Antoun, and Sakakini did return to their homelands, while Gibran died in New York, but stated in his will that he wanted his body to be buried in his native village. And it was, after his death, it was taken back. The church initially kind of refused to allow that, but then they relented, and now you can see it in Psherri. Coming from Maronite and Orthodox villages in Lebanon, and with a long tradition of monastic asceticism and worldly renunciation, Naimi, Rihani, and others could not tolerate the brutal conditions to which capitalism gave rise. Having to take on menial job and finding himself cleaning floors in factories, Khalil Sakakini constantly thought back on Jerusalem and its pleasant hills. These writers were the first Arab critics of industrial pollution and the disastrous impact it had on ecology. Recalling their own experiences in the smoggy cities of the United States, and combined with their readings of the Romantic English poets, they yearned for pristine nature, clean air, tree-covered mountains and valleys, the majestic mountains of Lebanon near the holy valley of Qannubin, or the sacred hills and promontories of Jerusalem. The other Americanization challenge, coming from regions where rulers were glorified and where subjects were at their mercy, the traveler Ilyas and numerous immigrant writers expressed amazement at the structure of government in the United States, the freedoms it granted, and the modesty of the American presidents and their wives. Yeah, I know. During his visit, Ilyas was so impressed with the wife of the president, Julia Grant. Ulysses Grant was president at the time, Julia Grant, who, when she came to the Egyptian section in the fair, the Philadelphia Fair, and walked around with him without putting on airs, asking questions, listening to his replies, never making him feel that he was an inferior, as doubtlessly he would have felt with the wife of the Khedive or with the European royal. Kawkab America reported how editor Erbili had visited President Cleveland, who praised the newspaper for serving, again in English, the Easterners' residents of America, end of quote. Later in that same year, Miss Farida Fluti went to the White House and presented the president with a gift from Lebanon. The president was an honest man of the people and not unwilling to mix with the high and the low. From New York, Rustum told a story, most likely exaggerated, about a lowly Syrian peddler. I quote, "A peddler with his kushi was audacious enough to go to the White House and ask to see the president, the late President McKinley. The answer came back that the president was busy. He said to the messenger, 'Tell the president I'm a Syrian man and would love to see him.' So the president came out and stood in front of him saying, 'Do you want to see me?' He answered, 'Yes, sir. I'm honored to see you. The president then turned around and around, saying, look at me carefully from every side. The Syrian man laughed and offered the president a little artifact with the carving of Jerusalem on it. The president gave him 100 rials. Rial was always a term used for the dollar. I doubt the president gave $100, but it's a nice story. Such a form of Americanization was deeply admired. From 1914 on, many Arab writers and activists began to advocate for the democratic form of government in their own countries. Fourth unit, finally, return. Emigrants expressed both admiration and uncertainty about immigration. As a result, an active dialogue on the pages of newspapers and periodicals in the United States and in the home countries ensued between those who had emigrated and those who had not. On 7 April 1894, editor Erbili described the members, as he wrote it, the members of our Syrian people as aliens in this foreign country, which legally at that time they were. In 1896, Sajjan Effendi Saadi described all Syrians as temporary residents. And in 1898, Yusuf Effendi Daher was certain that all immigrants would return to Lebanon with the wealth they had accumulated. Whenever people drank coffee together, wrote priest Khirbawi, they wished each other the following, quote, in expectation of your return to the homeland, God willing, end of quote. And many did return. After getting rich, some were eager to improve conditions in their homelands. Others returned after failure and despair. The cause of their failure was the same as for many other immigrants, racism. In her reference to the Irish in America, Frances Trollope, whom I mentioned earlier, bewailed the dire and miserable condition, as she said, of the laboring poor of our country, who thought of mending their condition by emigrating to the United States, end of quote. Racial distinctions separated the white laborers from the Irish, as they did from the Lebanese Arab immigrants. Maronite vermin, as the New York Times described them in 1891. Numberless and often nameless remain those who died on the peddling roads, fell victim to crime or murder, or committed suicide. After killing his wife, a Syrian lawyer in New York, Nasib Shibli, committed suicide, leaving the following note, quote, O my people, ya qawmi, I am the first among you who is a murderer and a suicide. How horrible are these words, forgive me, end of quote. Mirei was greedy for gold, as he wrote, and went in search during the gold rush in Alaska in the kind of early 1890s. At one point, he and two companions got lost in the vast wilderness of snow and became so famished and fraught that they cut out a piece of flesh from the thigh of a man who had died and boiled it for 6 hours, but it remained hard to chew. Mirei returned to Lebanon and wrote a memoir of his experience. It was both to inform people about Alaska, but also to warn them about it. Those who returned or never lived to return did not leave their stories, which is why the diary of Khalil Sakakini is so valuable. For in what could be the first daily diary in Arabic, he recorded his emotions and dreams every day during his stay in New York and Rumford Falls from 1907 to 1908. Sakakini described the daily tribulations, hopes, and despairs of the unsuccessful emigrant. In doing so, he was unique because he was a highly educated and cultured man who was able to articulate in brutal honesty his feelings in the face of hunger and loneliness, poverty and humiliation. Doubtless, the plight of thousands upon thousands of working immigrants in the United States. His diary is a record of a man without any business acumen, who hoped to teach and to assist scholars in their research, but ended up working in a factory, hauling packages and sweeping floors. His dreams always took him back to the genteel surroundings of Jerusalem, away from the industrial tumult of the New World, and to the memories of his beloved, her name was Sultana, living near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, to whom he returned eventually and then married. Through Arab eyes, the United States between 1876 and 1914 was complex, challenging, alluring, and new. A place to make money, but also a place of frightening alienation. A country where there was freedom of expression, but also where there was racial discrimination at its most vulgar. And a country where potentials could be realized, but where the mechanization and labor abuse killed the soul. It was a multiplicity of countries where some immigrants ta'amraku, became Americans, and were fulfilled in becoming immigrants, while others returned, eager to live again in the gentle mountains of Lebanon or the sacred hills of Jerusalem, without riches and with conflicted memories. Fortunately, many of the immigrants and emigrants left writings behind them, showing how the wealthy visitors saw what the peddler did not see, how women experienced what men did not, and how the educated reacted to what the illiterate never noticed. There was excitement as well as confusion, aspirations as well as delusions, admiration as well as criticism. The first Arab arrivals in America over a century and a half ago may well serve as a model for today's massive migration from the Middle East to Europe, and it used to be to the United States. The Moroccan critic Said Yaqtin urged the recent immigrants, refugees to Europe to emulate the early immigrants to the United States, and to establish literary and cultural ties, both with their host communities and their homelands. For him, it is important that the new arrivals learn from the new society, enrich their linguistic and cultural identity, and then contribute to their host country. His words recall the motto of Kaukab America in 1892, in English, that the word, the emigrants and the immigrants were to build, as the newspaper said, to build helpful relations and good understanding between the East and the West. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Matar. For question and answers, there are microphones on the side of the hall. Please walk to the mic if you have a question.
Do you remember Before the Flames, the book? Before the Flames, it was written by a Lebanese guy about 20 years ago, about the experience of Lebanese in California and stuff, and how we were treated like Greeks and Italians on that level.
That's difficult because, I mean, Arabs would not write that way about themselves. But definitely in the newspapers, particularly the New York Times and the New York Tribune, in the 1880s and 1890s, yes, there were these very, very kind of negative descriptions of the immigrants. But in their own writings, they were hopeful, but they were also afraid. So, I mean, I don't know if that answers it, but I mean,
the whole concept was that, like, first time I go to Latin America, I was on my own, drifting around, and when I land there, they looked at my name and they said Turku, because you were Ottoman. So, are you going to have you thought of combining the two experiences, the Syrians that go to Latin America? They've done a lot better than the ones here.
Depending when. I mean, obviously the closure of immigration for the Arabs and many other ethnicities was in 1924. But at this period, they were coming in through Ellis Island. Before that, it was another, but through Ellis Island. They were given some instructions as to how to facilitate their kind of entry. And the instructions were usually by friends. Take some merchandise with you, so you look at as merchants. Always answer that you don't accept polygamy, because sometimes they were afraid of that. Identity-wise, they were all seen as Turks. Initially, they were all referred to as Turks. And then it becomes Syrian. And then it's interesting, because I have a long discussion as to, what term did they use for themselves. And Amin Rihani wanted to use the term American Syrian. It never caught on. It was really Syrian and Arab. Arab not in a sense of a political sense, but in a sense of linguistic and cultural sense. They felt that, they felt that they're all the same, and particularly in terms of these publications, where it's interesting to see that, the almanac that was published had reference to immigrants all the way to in the Philippines, in South America, in every part that you could get responses from. He wrote. So he felt a sense of Arabicity. That's the kind of word I like to use. The Arabicity that kind of, brought them together. National identity, the Lebanese would have that. So somebody like Mikhail Rustam would say, Mikhail Rustam min Lubnan. But Lebanon had its specific status. I mean, after 1860, it was autonomous, so it had that sense of individual identity. But the others, they're basically Syrian. Somebody like Sakakini is always from Jerusalem. I mean, for him, that's it. That's the world. So he doesn't see himself beyond that. But they all interact as Arabic speakers. And what's really interesting, I mean, Sakakini is a fascinating person. That's why I kind of spent like 1/3 of the book translating him. Because, he describes the day-by-day activities of an immigrant who's not making it, who's not succeeding, And what's interesting about him is that he doesn't seem to know anything about America as such. It's the community that matters. It's, the friends, the kind of associates from Jerusalem, etc. And, he says the Americans celebrate the 4th of July, or yesterday was this. I mean, but he never gets engaged with that. And I don't find that elsewhere. I mean, unless people kind of decide to immigrate and basically integrate. Then you get somebody like Werd, who writes this, fabulous introduction to his book, praising the American flag and kind of how it is that we're going to fight tyranny in Cuba, and describes all the stories, which are, this and that. But so in terms of their identity, I think it was something that was being. I don't want to say negotiate, because I don't think many of them thought they would stay. I think the majority thought they would go back. Some did. Obviously, a large number didn't. But I think at the very beginning, when they came, they had no idea where they're coming. I mean, the story that I mentioned, which is perhaps the first-person account of coming or arriving in Syria. I mean, the guy, was in his village. Somebody comes around. He has money in his pocket. And he tells him, where did you get this money? He says, well, I made it in America. I said, okay, So he goes, picks up 3 of his buddies. They get on a boat, go to Marseille. And then, in Marseille, find this Jewish guy who tells them, don't go to New York, go to Philadelphia, it's better. So they go there, and, they slowly begin to learn to become peddlers. And then he becomes a wealthy merchant. So these people stayed. But in terms of, whether they had planned to do that, it's very unlikely. I mean, these people left families, et cetera. They want to come back with money. And so what their identity is, as I say, is something that's going to be difficult to square.
Get another question from.
Sure. Sorry.
One from that side.
One from there, one from there. Okay.
Sure. I was wondering if in your research you came across any stories you can share with us about Arabs who either came to Seattle or to the Northwest, or perhaps the West generally.
In the travels of the prince, he doesn't reach as far as the West Coast, but he reaches Minneapolis, actually. And he says it's very funny because every time they played the national anthem, they stood up and sang. It's one line. But they're not that far westward. But in terms of the correspondence, you get some correspondence, but the West Coast was too far.
I mean, I know you mentioned Mikhail Naima, who went to the University of Washington and lived in Walla Walla, and his nephew owned a furniture store in Walla Walla until just a few years ago.
Yeah, I mean, Naimi, he spent 20 years. So, in a sense, he had much more time to explore and to travel. But in his writing, for instance, he writes basically about, in his Sab'un, he writes about his experience, on the East Coast, at the university, in the army, etc. So, as I say, most of them didn't have that kind of exposure. All of them kind of, at the very beginning, Naimi again stayed till 1932, the Great Depression. So that's later. These early immigrants were more or less confined to these major cities on the East Coast. And as peddlers, they moved around. But those who settled were settling in that area, mainly.
Thank you.
Oh, I had a couple of things I wanted to say. First is an observation, which is I have read in Arabic some really amazing writings that were written by the Detroit automakers, the people who worked in the Ford factories and so forth, and they were expressing themselves in poetry as well as talking and writing in letters, and I wondered if you'd seen that anywhere else, or if that was...
They appear sometimes in Rustam's kind of various editions of the Diwan. He kind of reproduces that because he relied very much on other newspapers in the United States and other kind of sources of information. So he has kind of sometimes references to these, but not further than that. I mean, I don't know if there are, that'll be interesting to look at, but I didn't see them.
Yeah, well, they were, I think, the most, this is the observation part, they were most touching to me. Of all the things that I read were these poems where they were longing to go back.
Yeah.
Just exactly as you say, there's so much about this longing to return. And the other real question I had was actually about Nuaima, who, of course, did graduate from here in 1915 and immediately went into the Army and fought in World War I. And he's really the first one I've been able to find who fought in an American war. And he actually wrote some wonderful short stories about that. And I just wondered if you'd ever seen anybody else, you know, the Irish, for example, to talk about. Other groups, the Irish fought in the American Civil War. But I think that World War I was really the first period when we get...
That pushes it later. I mean, and he joined it at the very end. And then he doesn't know what to do. I mean, you know, should I stay? Should I go back? If I go back, what would I do? If I stay, what would I? And then he just hangs out until finally he leaves. I mean, $500 in his pocket. And he says, that's it. You know.
Back to New York,
yeah,
I think.
I know.
Thank you. There is another question over that side.
Of the individuals who returned back to the Middle East,
Sorry.
of the individuals who returned back to the Middle East, one, did any of them leave writing? And two, if they did they talk about how their American experience sort of changed the way they viewed their own homeland?
Okay, those who returned, I mean, two of the people that I'm translating actually did return and publish in Lebanon, published through the Ottoman press. Their concern was basically to alert their readers what's out there. And in a way, advertising, but also warning about that. But again, their idea is that you go there, make money, and come back. In terms of the perspective on the Middle East, that's very interesting because there are exchanges which are published in the newspapers, and particularly essays, in which local writers, I mean, Lebanese writers writing in an Arabic newspaper in the United States are responding to attacks on them by the Ottoman government, that they're leaving and they're taking the money with them and they're taking all the resources, and this is the youth that had they stayed there, they would build up the country, etc. And so they write back and say, well, why did we leave? We were kind of, we didn't have any opportunity. And, we're doing well here because, again, the reports from the Ottoman side are saying, you guys you're being starved there, you're not doing well. They're saying, no, we're doing well. We have much more organizational here that helps us. So the reflection on their homeland depends on whether they decided to stay or not. Now, the persons whom I've read and those who are publishing had more or less decided to stay. And so they're saying, well, what is there to offer us out there? Didn't we leave because the land was arid, et cetera, et cetera? So these are people who say. Those who returned and published, they seem to have done well, and they were happy about their experience. It was rough. I mean, Mirai kind of, describes as cannibalism. I don't know if it happened, but I mean, he describes all this, and he's putting it all in a frame of reference that, there is opportunity. Just watch out about that. But it's not that it's going to challenge your sense of belonging. I mean, he goes back, And he's very proud of being of the northern part of Lebanon. He doesn't say much about himself, but I mean, he still feels a sense of belonging in that environment.
There is one more question, or this time, I think after this question we can continue our conversation at the reception area.
Listening to this, I had a whole bunch of thoughts that I had never had about this whole issue. You said nothing about citizenship and becoming an American citizen. And the second thing that was going on in this period of time after the Civil War was the Homestead Act, which was granting land, 160 acres, to anybody who would go out and settle on it. Did the folks from the Middle East do that, and did they have to be citizens, or what was the process by which they would get involved in that?
Okay. They did go. I mean, Farah Hantoun actually writes encouraging the new immigrants to go and settle. And that he does that in the kind of early 1900s before citizenship. So basically, yes, they're aware of the homestead. They're aware that there's an opportunity there. And he actually, although he kind of laments what's happened to the Indians, but he's also saying, go and settle these lands. So yes, there is that movement into the regions which were being homesteaded to newly arriving immigrants. In terms of citizenship, they were trying to become citizens. It was kind of always confronted to them. It didn't work initially until 1915, where they begin to kind of activate more vigorously towards citizenship. But even so, it remains a very tenuous thing. But they are kind of granted, they begin to be granted citizenship. The whole point was whether to identify them as Turks, which was very problematic, or because there's a war going on, or what. And they wanted to be described differently. But they do aim at citizenship, and there are writings where, again, I like Rustum because he always makes fun. He said, we were about to be denied citizenship had it not been for the turkey. That it happened that it's just Thanksgiving, and Americans like to eat turkey, and they thought of the Turks, and therefore they were favorable to us. So if there's anything if there's anything that we can be grateful to, it's the turkey for that. So yes, they were aiming at that, and they did achieve that. But as I say, it was a very tenuous, and there were lots. I mean, I mentioned many of the kind of steps that had to be taken, and many of the opposition that was voiced against their citizenship, because they were seen, as I say, as vermin. They're seen as homeless peddlers. I mean, they didn't really they were not viewed as possible kind of future citizens, but they did.
I don't know what's wrong with being called Turk, but still, thank you very much, Nabil, and I want an applaud for
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.